Hi guys, this is for Sophomore US. Today we're going to talk about African Americans in the South, living in the Jim Crow South, and how they tried to adjust to what was basically a very horrendous living situation. So the Jim Crow laws were passed throughout the South after the end of Reconstruction, as we talked about in our last video. Remember, make sure you watch all these videos and you watch them from beginning to end. Now, the humiliation for blacks in the South was pretty much nonstop. Remember, they lost their right to vote. You always had the threat of physical violence, right, with lynching, and economic pressure. Most African Americans really had to be sharecroppers in the South because there really weren't any other options for them. A lot of black businessmen, tradesmen who tried to create a middle class life through business often found it hard to find white clients, and you needed to have white clients if you were down south. Now, there was a pretty hideous system in the South called the convict lease system. Now, what that meant was that if you were a landowner, you could actually get a convict. You could lease a convict from the state who would then work on your land for free. This raised money for a lot of state governments, but it also perpetuated a system that was very similar to slavery. The convicts were disproportionately African American, so basically these plantation owners got a source of free labor to toil for them, which isn't very much different than the slavery system. It was cheap, well, not cheap labor; it was free labor, and it was also controllable. Right? These convicts who come work for you, disproportionately African American, can't exactly just leave, right? Because they're convicts. So the thing is that this system continued for decades in the South and perpetuated a new version of slavery. Now, the convict lease system and the fact that the South remained a basically agricultural society really discouraged white immigration to the South. There was, just like before the Civil War, there still was very little immigration to the South. And remember, well, not remember, we haven't talked about this yet, but starting in the 1880s, the United States ushered in a wave of mass immigration, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe. But almost all these immigrants decided to make their life in the Northeast or the Midwest. Very few of them decided to go down south because a lot of them didn't really see any opportunities for them in the South with this backwards agricultural system that had a convict lease as its foundation. Now, remember we talked about in our last video the fact that race was deliberately used by Southern politicians as a diversionary tactic. Life in the South was pretty bad for white people too, but a way to kind of distract people's attention away from that was to just kind of bring up race and racial issues, because that was a way that would actually unite the white South together, both poor and rich. So it was a terrible situation. Now, reform movements in the late 19th century attempted, like mainly the populist movement that we talked briefly about in the last video, really tried to unite poor Southerners together, poor whites and poor blacks together in a new political party that would challenge democratic dominance of Southern politics. But the way that this effort was killed was for Democratic white supremacists to continue to bring up the racial issue, right? You don't want to join a political party with black people because you're superior to black people. So, and that killed really any attempt at a biracial political cooperation. And it also ushered in the Jim Crow laws in the South toward voting. So the thing is that was out of the question too, but it was so cynical, right? To use these racial issues as a way to try to divert white people's attention away from real problems that they had. Now, Northern Republicans, who, remember, they were the ones who have been defending black rights, for decades, to some degree, really kind of lost interest in doing anything for African Americans. Sometimes they gave lip service to it and say, "Oh yeah, we support black people's rights in the South," but they really didn't do anything about it. Now, one of the facts of life in the North, in the post-Reconstruction era, was a premium was placed on sectional harmony. Let's move past the Civil War. Let's unite North and South together again. That was like a a really important priority for a lot of Northerners during these years. So the thing is, bringing up racial issues or African American rights certainly was something that would undermine sectional unity. So the thing that was yet another reason why racial issues were really not mentioned, as well as Northern racism. Right, a lot of Northerners were racist and really did not want to really excite any sort of effort on behalf of Black people. Now, how did Black people themselves respond to these appalling conditions? Now, African Americans were kind of divided on like how to respond to these conditions. Probably the two men that kind of encapsulated the division the best was in one man named Booker T. Washington, and another. Some of you guys went to that middle school named after him, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, let's talk about Booker T. Washington first. Now, Booker T. Washington was the foremost Black leader in the United States during his lifetime. He was born into slavery. He was freed by the Civil War in 1865, and he placed a premium on education. He said the way that Black people are really going to improve their situation is to get an education. He founded the Tuskegee Institute in 1881. And the thing is that Booker T. Washington, his view of education was probably different than the way we think of education today. Now, what Booker T. Washington said is that Black people should focus on acquiring useful skills. They should learn how to be better farmers. They should learn how to be carpenters. They should learn trades, basically. As opposed to getting into the professions. He also encouraged teaching because, excuse me, there needed to be Black people who would be willing to educate younger Black people, right? So the thing is that what he was encouraging when he said education wasn't. You could actually argue in many ways was not very progressive at all, saying that Black people really shouldn't be focused on getting a traditional classical education as was seen at the time. Learning some history, some classics, English, science, and all of that. Basically, just get useful skills that can actually get you employed. Now, Washington's policy was called accommodation. Now, let's see if I can spell. Accommodation. Now, accommodation kind of took two forms. One was what we discussed, the fact that Black people should focus on getting useful skills as an education. But also, Booker T. Washington said that Black people really should resist Jim Crow or really fight back against political oppression. Basically focus on improving yourself economically, get a useful education, and then a job and a middle-class life, and then perhaps you'll show white people that you're worthy of rights. So this was just on the whole a very maybe not very, but it was a conservative vision, a more conservative vision for how Black Americans should adjust to this situation. So basically, ignore segregation, ignore political discrimination, and focus on improving yourself economically. And Booker T. Washington was very, very popular among white people. White liberals, or insofar as whatever you could call a liberal back then, a lot of rich white people supported this, right? Because they satisfy their idealism, saying, "Oh, I'm helping Black people," but at the same time didn't upset things too much by pushing for an end to Jim Crow or something like that, which perhaps would be unacceptable to a lot of white people. So Booker T. Washington got a lot of support from the upper crust of white society. Andrew Carnegie, who was probably one of the most famous men in America, the founder of Carnegie Steel, was a big supporter. Some of the people in the Rockefeller organization were supportive of Booker T. Washington. The head of Sears was a big supporter of Booker T. Washington. So a lot of prominent white people supported Booker T. Washington, and also some middle class blacks supported Booker T. Washington. A biography was written of Booker T. Washington a few years ago, and they asked the writer, well, he Booker T. Washington said, don't focus that much on improving improving political conditions. Don't focus on Jim Crow and things like that. They asked the author, well, how would Booker T. Washington respond today to the fact that the people who advocated the precise opposite of what Booker T. Washington advocated, people like Martin Luther King and people involved in the civil rights movement, were the ones who yielded the success that they got in the 1960s. And this author had a very interesting answer. He would say he would still be very concerned, because he would say that black people haven't made the economic gains that they could have if his strategy was implemented. So that was a very interesting take, on like what a modern day Booker T. Washington would think of the situation of Black America now. But basically, he said, be patient. Don't aggravate white people too much. Don't focus on ending Jim Crow. Improve yourself. Now, a black leader who had a completely different vision was a man named W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois was a northern black American. He was the first black man to earn a PhD from Harvard, and he wrote a book in the early 20th century called "The Souls of Black Folk," where he basically rejected accommodation, rejected Booker T. Washington, which was which was a big deal back then, because Booker T. Washington was such a legendary figure in white and black America, and said that no, we have to fight Jim Crow, we have to demand equal rights. The right to vote, an end to segregation, and we have to resist racism. That this basically Booker T. Washington's vision is way too to coin a phrase, accommodating. Right? He called it accommodation, Washington, and he said it's too accommodating. Du Bois did. So Du Bois and others formed a movement called the Niagara Movement in order to organize for greater rights for black Americans. Now, Du Bois was involved in 1909 in the founding of a group that became the preeminent black rights group in America, the NAACP. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And the NAACP was at the forefront of the civil rights movement for most of the 20th century, rejecting segregation and advocating a more forceful approach to resistance. I don't mean forceful in terms of a violent approach at all, but certainly aggressively opposing Jim Crow, using the courts to try to advance black rights. So certainly a lot more of a forceful approach than anything Booker T. Washington advocated. Booker T. Washington, interestingly, was the first black man to ever be invited to the White House. Theodore Roosevelt in 1901 invited Booker T. Washington to the White House. Southern newspapers howled in protest. But that kind of shows you the status that Booker T. Washington had in America during his lifetime. But again, many black people just felt it was Du Bois's group felt it was just way too passive. Now, black people were faced with increasing violence in the South. Remember, the lynchings were out of control in the South in the late 19th, early 20th century. And a writer named Ida B. Wells was a Chicago-based writer and lecturer who began talking about lynching to northern white audiences, writing about it, speaking about it. And for a lot of white people, they were just living in, blissful ignorance about what was going on to black people in the South. The average white person in the North just never really thought about black people. Remember the Civil War and slavery, I guess, but never really thought about the current situation of blacks. And Ida B. Wells was trying to get people to act in the North to try to become more aware of, what was going on to black people down south. Most blacks in the South accepted their horrendous situation, and very few moved to the North. Up until 1917, which is when World War I started, and a lot of black people began what they called the Great Migration, the vast majority of black people lived down south. About 90% of African Americans lived in the South. Of course, there was always the question, if we were in class, this always comes up. Well, why didn't black people move? Why didn't they go up north? Well, there were a lot of reasons. One, a lot of black people had long-standing ties to the South, right? Their family was down south. Their ancestors had been down south. Their lives were in the South. They thought of themselves as Southern. Also, some black people say, is it really going to be that much better up north? And that actually was a point, because then when black people did begin moving up north, they were often relegated to the worst section of northern cities, which of course was the beginning of the urban ghetto. Now, another word about the political situation in the South. Remember that term we used in our last video, the Solid South. The Solid South was the fact that the white South was completely under the control of the Democratic Party, which the foundation of its power was denying black people the right to vote, because black people are not going to vote for the Democratic Party in the South if they'd had the right. They're basically, this sounds maybe a little over the top, but I don't think so. There basically was the South was basically a one-party state. Almost every state in the old Confederacy was completely controlled by the Democratic Party. A two-party system, a vigorous two-party system, is usually seen as necessary for a democracy. To offer voters contrasting points of view. And voters where everybody having the right to vote. But there was only white people could vote in the South, and only the Democratic Party basically ran things in the South for decades. Now, one strategy that Southerners used to actually build up their power was to elect the same people to Congress for years, decades. They had these congressmen from the South with senators who were there for 20, 30, 40 years. Now, the reason for that, or one major reason for it, is that power in Congress is basically accrued based on seniority, right? The longer you're in Congress, the more power you have. So the South wound up amassing an enormous amount of power in Congress and in our national government, because they were electing the same people to office for decades. And the thing is that this gave the South a disproportionate amount of influence in the national government, because most congressional committees were actually run by, when the Democrats were in charge of Congress, were run by Southerners. And basically nothing happens in Congress without the support of congressional committee chairs. Now, these people were called the Dixiecrats, to kind of differentiate them from more traditional Northern Democrats, right, who were more liberal on almost all issues than the Southern Democrats were. Dixiecrats had very conservative views on economic issues, in addition to racial issues. They generally were very skeptical of the idea of having a large federal role in people's lives. And of course, that comes from deep-seated Southern opposition to a strong federal government that goes back to the founding of our country, and of course culminated in the Civil War. So the Dixiecrats had a stranglehold on the National Democratic Party, which is a reason why that for decades the National Democratic Party really didn't advocate civil rights at all. And that when the Democratic Party in the mid 20th century began advocating civil rights more forcefully, that's what actually got a lot of Southerners to finally begin leaving the Democratic Party, and join the Republican Party, who abandoned their longstanding support for equal rights in order to welcome, or at least assertively supporting equal rights, in order to get more Southern support. The race and the Southern obsession with race warped the South for decades. Because the thing is, the South could never really develop. It could never develop politically. It could never develop economically, because they were so obsessed with actually keeping the Jim Crow system in place. So white people were also hurt profoundly by the Jim Crow system in the South. Because the South, the rest of the country was moving on. They were building their economy. We were becoming an industrial giant during this time, becoming the richest nation on earth, while the South was relegated to almost a backwater, completely dominated by agriculture, cotton production, and obsessed with race, and unable really to do much of anything else because of that obsession. All their energy went into propping up Jim Crow. All right, guys. So hopefully you listened again from start to finish. And in our next video, we're gonna leave the South, as did many Northern Northerners in their mind, like during this time, they didn't want to think about the South anymore. And I'm going to talk about the political situation in America in the late 19th century, a time that's generally seen as boring politics with very little difference between the parties, but also some of the hardest partisanship of American history. People were more loyal probably to their party during this era than really any other, except maybe the present day, even though there were very few differences between the parties. So we'll talk about why that was. All right. So hopefully you're all doing well, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.